Well, hello lovelies. Today we're going to be looking at my inking process, taking a thumbnail to a finished large-scale inked drawing. Of course, every single drawing starts off as a thumbnail in my sketchbook, and then I pick which ones I want to translate into a large-scale piece. This particular piece was for Square Carousel, which is the illustration collective I am a part of. I will link it in the description box below. The theme for this particular challenge was community, and of course, since I'm moving towards a school bus tiny home, I focused on the tiny home community. I would love to one day live in a tiny home community that has a shared land. I think that's a really fun prospect that maybe I could find in the future. For now, I'm happy with my schoolie build, but anyways, for this particular drawing, I sketched out in my sketchbook, and then I drew directly on the canvas. Now, sometimes I do like to make the line work more finalized on computer paper, and then I transfer it onto the finished canvas, but for this particular piece, I knew that I could pretty much freehand everything that I wanted, so I blocked everything out freehand. And you'll see I use a couple of tools here. I used my 90-degree L-shaped ruler that I got from the dollar store, probably one of the better dollar store finds. Then I also used my regular rulers, 18 inches and 12-inch. I also use a couple of stencils in this video, some circle stencils that I purchased from Amazon. All of the materials used will be linked in the description box below with Amazon affiliate links, which means if you make a purchase through those links, I do get a little bit of a kickback. It helps me to keep making new videos on this channel. Now let's get back to the drawing. So by now I have finished laying out all of my finished pencils. I have a pretty good idea of how I want things to look. And then as I move into each individual house, I am going to add more details. But for now, I'm going to be just blocking out the basic black color. So by looking at my thumb, I can tell exactly where the biggest black sections are going to be. So you'll see sometimes I mark those out with little X's, and that's something that I learned from sequential art classes, which is, if you're not familiar, that means the art of making sequential images, aka comic books and storyboarding. But in particular with comic books, when you make little black X's, that means that that is going to be blocked in with ink, and usually that's used because the person who does the pencils is different than the person who inks the image. But I picked that up from that class and I use it for myself because it's a great visual reminder of which sections are going to be inked out without constantly having to look back at my thumbnail. I am using a Winsor Newton ink that is a waterproof ink once it's dried, but you can add water to it to kind of dull it down. I'm using the straight black ink straight out of the bottle, and I'm just using some cheap Walmart brushes to go ahead and lay on some thick layers. Once I move into the details, I do use much more expensive, much nicer watercolor brushes because you will not find the small like 000 or 000 watercolor brushes in cheap brushes. You really need to have a nice brush to be able to get thin, tiny, detailed lines like I'm doing here. These brushes aren't always available online through Amazon or normal stores. I usually have to go to a specialty store like a local art store, or I order them online from Dick Blick. The best part about laying out my blacks is I get a very quick idea of what my composition is starting to look like, and I can balance that out if necessary at this stage before I start adding on details. And I do add in a few more hills and blocks of black that I initially did not anticipate to make because I felt like there was a lot of empty white space in the background. Now that I'm moving into adding details, each house I add the details in pencil, especially with the arches and some of the windows and line work. A lot of that stuff isn't something I'm drawing all the time, and so I do prefer to have the pencil lines to kind of guide me. I'm not going for a perfect architecture style of illustration with this. This is very loose, wavy lines, cute houses, not exactly proportionate. You'll notice the cat in the window really isn't proportionate to that type of window. The cat's a little bit too big, but that is all part of the charm of this illustration. I was not trying to be realistic. I was trying to be stylized. I wanted each house to have a different feel, as if a different person was living in each house. But there are some consistencies throughout the design to help with the composition and balance. As with most of my pieces, I focus heavily on lines and shapes to create an interesting composition that feels balanced and visually rhythmic. There are a few segments where I jump ahead. This piece took me quite a few days, and also I did take it home with me and work on it a little bit at home when I didn't have access to my camera. This overall piece took about 15 to 20 hours. I didn't keep track for this particular painting. It took quite a long time, and what you see on the screen is actually only 4.5 hours worth of that. So there was a lot of little details and line work that is not done, but I pretty much show you my process for a few of these houses so that you get an idea of what adding in the details looks like. And there definitely is two different levels of details. I first add in the blacks, like I mentioned, the black blocking, and then I add in more details like the lines in the mountain, the sun, which are not tiny, tiny details. They're more detailed than just blocking in the blacks. So it's kind of like my basic line work. And then after that, that's when I go in with the microns and add in the fine details, the tiny flowers, the little embellishments on the windows, some of the texture detailing on the fences, the doors, the doormats. And I added in some more blacks on the grass in the front. I really wanted to add in some more pattern to the piece, repetitive patterns. So I started in adding lines to the hills and then little dashes and arrows and dots in the gravel on the bottom. And that is all part of my style. This is my favorite part of creating pieces is rhythmic patterns and little tiny details that you really don't notice unless you're looking closely at the piece, which when you're zoomed in on the camera, you can obviously see these details as I'm doing them. But when you see the piece in person and in the gallery, the little tiny details kind of blend together and create this shading. And it's not until you step closer to the piece that you realize that they're all individual lines and dots and arrows. So it has a really interesting impact on the viewer in person that you kind of lose a little bit when you're looking at me doing it on the camera, through the camera. These are all things I think about because this work is not just meant to be a digital piece, but also a physical piece that I sell in my studio. So it's a little bit different than how some other illustrators work who are simply working for print. Now that doesn't mean that these pieces won't be put into print. Almost all of my illustrations are eventually made into physical prints and then also cards. And sometimes for some designs, they're made into stickers. But a lot of these little details that you're seeing and a lot of little flourishes will probably get lost in a card or a print. And to really appreciate them, you have to buy the original piece. Something to be aware of in this piece is tangents. And I don't really talk about that a lot in my videos. I don't believe I've talked about it too much. But essentially what a tangent is when two lines either directly touch or bump up against each other, and it creates this visual tension because sometimes you can't tell if it's on the same layer or if the background is supposed to be behind the pieces. If you look up tangents, you can see some really good examples of what I'm talking about. Some simple examples would be like a pole coming out of the back of a girl's head. It may look like she's wearing a hat, or it's supposed to be a pole in the background. If you don't make your images overlap, if you make them too close but not actual overlapping, then visually they can appear to be on the same plane. And you'll see in this piece, I do try to pay attention to that. In every piece, I try to pay attention to it, but I'm not always successful. Sometimes there are tangents that happen and you don't see them until you're finished and it's too late. But for this particular piece, I feel like I did a fairly good job. There is actually one tangent that I did go back and fix after I even scanned it. On the original, I did fix it. The top of one of the background houses is perfectly touching the back ridge, and it drove me really insane when I was editing this in the computer, but I was able to fix it on the original piece. So that's an example of a tangent. You can maybe see it for yourself in the finished piece when I show it at the end of the video. Overall, this piece took a lot of time. It's very detailed. It's very difficult to do this level of detail and patterning on a piece. Overall, there's a lot of details and work that I pour into these pieces, and that is where my heart and soul is. That's where I absolutely love creating the most, and I hope that you enjoy looking at my process, and I hope that you enjoy illustrations like this. And if you do, hopefully you'll stick around and hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, let me know what you think in the comment box below. And of course, helpful critiques are always welcome. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, remember to create, love, and travel on. See you next week. Bye!